Carolyn McLeod, one of the co-leaders with Sheila Rule for the Riverside Church Prison Ministry. We work to reform the criminal justice system because too much talent and potential is caged behind prison walls. Too many elders are experiencing death by incarceration, and justice is too often denied to men and women and children of darker hue.
Hi, I'm Rainer, and for me, climate justice is deeply linked with racial justice because, firstly, the climate crisis is racist historically. Both the climate crisis and systemic racism have their roots in colonization and the accompanying exploitation of both people and the environment. Secondly, the biggest injustice for me of the climate crisis is that those who bear the least responsibility for it are the ones who will suffer the most. And thirdly, the climate crisis will likely amplify existing injustice both globally and locally, so we must prioritize the most vulnerable people to create a livable and a just planet for all.
Good morning, friends. I am Sumati Devadat, the chair of the Mission and Social Justice Commission. On behalf of the Commission, I extend to you a warm welcome to today's Anti-Racist Day of Action. Thank you so very much for joining us to resist the persistent and deeply damaging acts of racism that create so much personal and social chaos and destroy the bodies and souls of many. Every Sunday at Riverside, we are fortunate to be reminded that our faith calls us to face down injustices. Last Sunday, we heard the Reverend Dr. Willie James Jennings provocatively characterize systems of injustices as systems of death. Death, he said, is a malignant, greedy thief that takes as much of life as possible, scattering and separating and isolating us from each other. And as we fail to protect the first victims, the most vulnerable in our society, death marches on, intent in swallowing up all of creation. We see this pattern repeated throughout history. But the wisdom of our Christian faith is clear. Our spiritual ancestors and Christ, through his life and ministry, assure us that death will not have the last word. Compassion and love, planted in us by God, can enable us to make sure that life will prevail. Today, we come together as a community of faith to affirm our commitment to life, to align ourselves with the oppressed, to insist that all life can and must flourish. Inspired by this conviction, the members of the Mission and Social Justice Commission and Charity Radway, our administrative assistant, have put many hours into bringing you this program. I am grateful to each of you. A PDF document will now be posted in chat that summarizes all of today's proceedings and provides important resources and tools that you can use going forward. Please, we urge you to use it. And now as we begin our program, would you kindly mute yourselves? Thank you.
Good afternoon, or good morning, everyone. It'll be afternoon soon. I just wanted to take a moment to go over today's schedule. We're already beginning our welcome and welcome here. We'll start with a land acknowledgement, and then we'll hear some readings from scripture to kind of ground us. After that grounding, we'll get a little bit of a spiritual charge from Reverend Michael Livingston. And then we'll see some presentations on voter suppression, environmental racism, and mass incarceration and immigrant detention. We'll set up with a little bit of instruction for the breakout rooms and then take a 5-minute break. And coming back from that break, we will then just go right into our breakout rooms and spend about 30 minutes taking some very specific actions. Coming out of that break room, we'll take some time for questions and reflections. We'll have an exit poll, and then we will have a closing prayer and song. So thank you and welcome.
As we gather this morning, we take these moments to acknowledge the Lenape people, on whose unceded territory many of us in the greater New York City and New Jersey area live, work, and worship daily. In the godly spirit that is mindful and loving of all peoples in our shared world, may we find new ways to honor our complex relationship with the Lenape and create space for their culture, build bridges for their people, all towards the promise of an abundant, just, and equitable society.
Woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees to deprive the poor of their rights and withhold justice from the oppressed of my people, making widows their prey and robbing the fatherless.
For since the beginning of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have clearly been seen, being understood from what has been made. So the people are without excuse.
Keep on loving one another as brothers and sisters. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. Continue to remember those in prison as if you were together with them in prison, and those who are mistreated as if you yourselves were suffering.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this very important gathering today and the work that you're doing as MSJ. These texts are among hundreds, perhaps even thousands, in the scriptures that ground what you're doing as the work of God. I just want to say that up front. It's easy to find text in scripture which support very broadly and very particularly the kind of work for justice that's going on at Riverside and in so many places in our world. This first text from Jeremiah, all the woes, woe to those, woe. I don't want to really focus on the woe. That's for those who make those unjust laws and who deprive the poor of their rights and who withhold justice from the oppressed, who prey on the elderly and rob children. They can read this and dread, if they have the conscience for it, the day that is coming. But what I want to say is that this isn't about them. It's for us to recognize that this is systemic. Laws, rights, justice, these are made in legislatures and they're adjudicated in courts. And when they're abused, God's people suffer. And it's important to understand, as I know you all do, that this can't be about charity, about driving people to the polls, about providing lunch and water while they wait, as important and essential as these things are, as getting out the vote. All these things are critical and essential and have to be done. But we'll be doing them until the end of time if we don't make the structural changes that make this kind of charity, this kind of caring for people essential. Do you remember Bill Clinton's famous line, "It's the economy, stupid"? Well, I want to amend it and reduce the arrogance quotient of it and say it's structural, friends. It's structural. And this makes clear that this is God's will for us. We stand with God and God with us when we do the work that we're talking about here today. When we systemically fight the voter suppression that's gripping our nation. We're watching it happen right before our very eyes. In the text on environmental racism, I was listening to Richard Rohr a few weeks ago, and as I heard him speak, he said something that made me think about this and that I wanted to share with you this morning. And he said essentially that Christ's anointing, the Christ mystery, is that whenever matter and spirit are operating as one, that this started at the moment of the Big Bang. The infinite life of the Trinity outflowed, manifesting itself in everything your eyes have ever seen. It's all one sacred ecosystem, he said. The true mystic wants to kneel and kiss the ground every day. He lives, she lives in a sacred universe. The ego has taken it upon itself to decide what is sacred. That's why we have racism and sexism. And the point he was trying to make was it's all sacred. God is in every particle of the universe since the beginning of the universe itself. And the manipulation of this created world to disadvantage, to make ill, to wound, to create suffering among especially the most vulnerable people among us is a denial of God present in the world, every bit of it, the sacredness of every piece of ground we see, everything we've ever seen since the beginning of time, and is then at the core of the work of people of faith to dismantle, to both save the earth and to both protect the most vulnerable from the ravages of the earth by our careless stewardship of it, a lack of stewardship of it, really. And then this last area, the mass incarceration and immigrant detention, I just want to read quotes from Brian Stevenson to you. He speaks as eloquently about this as anyone, and of course there are many others, Michelle Alexander, for example. But each of us, he writes, is more than the worst thing we've ever done. The true measure of our character is how we treat the poor, the disfavored, the accused, the incarcerated, and the condemned. He wrote once that capital punishment means them without the capital get the punishment. But simply punishing the broken, walking away from them or hiding them from sight only ensures that they remain broken, and we do too. There is no wholeness outside of our reciprocal humanity. Mutual love, empathy. If we can't see ourselves in others, any others, then we're on a one-way street to a kind of a mass incarceration for all of us. I think too of Martin Luther King's, one of his famous and piercing quotes from his letter from a Birmingham jail. You've heard this many times. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. George Floyd's murder may be the clearest example of this we'll know in our lifetime. And we could substitute almost any name here among the many that have been slaughtered in the last year and the years prior. The whole world watched those 9 minutes. We haven't been the same since. He didn't belong in the criminal justice system. He deserved, we all do, a nation of justice, a system that is designed around our common humanity, our mutual destiny. The scriptures, our Christian scriptures, as well as the scriptures, the holy writings of all the major religions, reflect this truth, our mutuality, God's image in all of this, all of us, the sacredness of human life, the common bond that we share on the planet. And then I want to close with this, anti-racist day of action. And let's look at the anti-racist part of it first. You know, and I want to thank Sumati for beginning with a word from Willie James Jennings. You know, I'm reading Beyond Whiteness and Education and Belonging, his latest book. And he writes this at one point. Whiteness invites us to imagine that we have become invisible to ourselves. Let me start that again. Whiteness invites us to imagine that we become visible to ourselves and others only through its narration of our lives. It was inherent to the way Europeans transformed the world into private property and reorganized intellectual life within their cognitive empire. They imagined they could see the people of the world better than the peoples of the world could see themselves, and that their insight was key to forming institutionalizing processes that were crucial to global well-being. They were as indispensable as God. And the truth is that God is reflected in all of us. And the ultimate work of anti-racism will be to teach the world that there is only one race, one people in the family of God. And we'll inhabit this world as people who belong together, or will continue to destroy one another and the earth as well. And that's why what you're doing here is so important. Talking about organizing around anti-racist work. I can't imagine that there's anything any more important for us as a people today than this, because the very issues that you're talking about here, saving the planet, respecting the right of every person to have a voice and a vote in decisions that affect all of our lives. All of these things are critical and central to the work that we're called to do. And I thank you for doing it.
Amen.
Thank you, Reverend Livingston.
You are welcome.
Suppressing the votes of people of color and other highly vulnerable groups of people is abhorrent, and it puts us on a slippery slope that endangers our democracy, including our ability to demand just environmental and carceral policies and practices. Dr. Andrea Miller from the nonpartisan voting rights group Reclaim Our Vote introduces the issue and the effectiveness of our advocacy.
In 2020, we sent 9.6 million postcards to voters. We postcarded the entire state of North Carolina, all the community of color voters. We postcarded all the community of color voters in the great state of Georgia. We made 1.9 million phone calls to voters. In the Georgia primary, which was in June of 2020, we found that out of 75,000 phone calls that we made to the rural Georgia Black Belt, 57,000 people actually showed up to vote. And out of those 57,000 voters that showed up, 25,000 of them were brand new voters, meaning they had never voted before. So we have always cared very much about making sure that our older voters, our rural voters, our poor voters would be able to cast a ballot. And unfortunately, in 2020, in the 21st century, it's actually getting harder.
This map shows the breadth of voter suppression. Nearly 400 bills have been introduced in 48 states, most in southern and Midwestern states with high poverty. Laws have already passed in Georgia, in Arizona, Florida, and Iowa, with Texas soon to follow.
Specific measures include stricter eligibility requirements, limits on early, through, and 24-hour in large cities, stricter ID laws, greater power to poll watchers, encouraging voter intimidation. Bills targeting African American voting specifically, for example, Sunday afternoon souls to the polls, and looser laws of voters.
Measures target people's very humanity. This is a picture of Senator John Ossoff trying to repeal the Georgia rule that was passed recently that prohibited volunteers from distributing water to people standing in line.
In November 2020, a record 73% of the electorate voted because COVID required sensible legal access. Turnout was big in communities of color and impoverished and rural communities.
Why suppress voting rights? You will recognize this picture. On January 6th, then President Trump called on his supporters to obstruct the peaceful transition of power at the Capitol and to overturn the 2020 election results and change voting laws. He continues to insist that the 2020 election was rigged and fraudulent. The truth, every state legislature and the federal government said that November 2020 election was secure.
Clearly, voter suppression is part of today's new Jim Crow.
Yes, white supremacy. Old or new, Jim Crow insists that white supremacy be maintained. The old Jim Crow featured racially biased literacy tests, poll taxes, voter intimidation, and murders of voting rights advocates, and
the brutality at the Selma March.
That brutality motivated the federal government.
If you put some butter on the boil, I could make some hot tea.
That brutality motivated the federal government to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
That act protected the 15th Amendment right to vote, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, and enforced voting rights by requiring states with a history of voter suppression to get pre-clearance before they enacted any changes in their voting laws.
But then,
in 2013, the US Supreme Court eliminated pre-clearance, opening the door legally to the rush of voter suppression measures we are seeing now.
voter suppression narrows the electorate and further consolidates power in the hands of a few. It will derail the economic and social progress of all but a few Americans. And it will maintain the systems of racism in our environmental, carceral, and immigration policies. It is for this reason that we start with voter suppression today. Without securing voting rights, nothing else will happen.
There's much that we can do now and beyond. Put pressure on your senators to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill, which would restore preclearance, and For the People Act, which would set federal mandates for states on voting rules. Those rules would include, that are proposed in the act, include automatic voter registration, early voting, no excuse mail-in voting, restoration of voting rights to ex-felons, nonpartisan redistricting commissions, and diminishing big money in politics. The New York Times yesterday said we should also encourage addition of protections for counting of votes.
You can also press Senator Schumer to bring changes to the filibuster to the Senate floor so these bills can pass. The filibuster is a real obstacle. Just one senator can start a filibuster. 60 votes are required to overcome it. That is an extremely high bar, as was proved on May 28th, when the Senate could not muster the votes to bring consideration of a bipartisan commission to investigate the January 6th attack on the Capitol.
We can also phone bank and write postcards with Andrea Miller's group, Reclaim Our Vote, nonpartisan voting rights organization working with people of color to fight voter suppression and reform the filibuster. And join the Poor People's Campaign to advance the third Reconstruction bill, which attacks poverty and promotes people's rights. In fact, they have an action Monday at 1 o'clock outside Carolyn Maloney's office. Information is in the PDF handout. Thank you.
This afternoon, we're looking at environmental racism. We'll define it and propose actions that each of us can take to address environmental racism at the federal, state, and local level. Environmental racism exists when people of color suffer disproportionately from pollution, industrial development, and toxic air and water, often as the result of corporate or governmental indifference and neglect. Environmental racism creates unhealthy living conditions. It leads to high rates of disease, such as asthma, cancer, and lead poisoning. Frequently, communities suffering from environmental racism lack access to jobs and face challenges in being heard.
This video from Harlem's We Act further vividly defines environmental racism for us all to see.
The mantra of the environmental justice movement is that we speak for ourselves.
Environmental justice is something that everybody is entitled to. It's a right.
It's a constant movement for healthiness, for a clean environment, for people living longer and happier.
Certain communities are targeted for pollution and do not receive environmental benefits. Those communities are generally communities of color and low income around this country. So environmental justice is the fair and equal treatment of all people in all communities. The environment is in our neighborhoods where we live, work, play, and go to school. We were able to get the MTA to invest in compressed natural gas buses and then in hybrid buses.
When they idle the actual buses inside, it goes into a particular piece of equipment. It just purifies it a little bit. Yeah. If it wasn't for We Act, we wouldn't have known all of this.
Now every city bus is cleaned up. Every community resident in this city is benefiting.
We control what happens to our community.
There you go.
And that's the best part about it.
At the federal level, advocates for the Green New Deal have proposed the Thrive Agenda. Thrive is a legislative plan to invest in the economy, to combat environmental racism, confront climate change, and renew our nation's infrastructure.
We are challenged as humankind has never been challenged before.
We know the dangerous catastrophic effects of
climate crisis,
the corporate greed of the fossil fuel industry,
COVID-19, high rates of unemployment,
trying to pay off my student debt while dealing with racial and gender injustice.
This is why we must pass the Thrive Agenda.
It's time to transform, heal, and renew by investing in vibrant economies.
Because it's high time that our federal government implement a just recovery to support Black, Indigenous,
working class, and immigrant communities.
These same communities are home to frontline workers who are getting sick and dying at a higher rate than anyone else.
We need to see jobs created that support frontline workers
so that we can continue to work while our loved ones are being taken care of while they're the most vulnerable.
Our communities deserve to be healthy. We deserve jobs with living wages.
We need to build things in America again
in a way that isn't going to exploit the environment.
The Thrive Agenda retrains those who will be put out of the fossil fuel industry.
We have the resources, but we must bring them all together and make the connection between climate and the economy and race.
The Thrive Agenda moves us towards justice, sustainability, and right relationship with our Earth.
Support Thrive if you want green transit, green infrastructure.
We would be able to create millions of good-paying jobs.
Unionized, high-paying, clean energy jobs.
Clean air.
Clean, safe, affordable drinking water.
And the further strengthening of our union rights.
Those most in need cannot be an afterthought.
As the video indicates, Thrive is designed to promote environmental justice and economic recovery for communities of color. Next slide, please. Thrive will invest $1 trillion a year in green infrastructure for 10 years to create and sustain more than 15 million American jobs, slash climate pollution in half, and President Biden's new budget proposal invests more than $900 million for EPA environmental justice programs. The Thrive Agenda translates the overarching goals of the Green New Deal into concrete benefits for local communities. Complementing the Thrive Agenda, President Biden's American Jobs Plan will rebuild the infrastructure for clean drinking water and transform U.S. energy infrastructure. It will remove all lead pipes and service lines in U.S. drinking water systems, eliminating a major source of lead poisoning for American children. It will also create jobs to renew our electric grid and cap orphan oil and gas wells, limiting the environmental harm caused by fossil fuels. Later, in our breakout session, we will discuss actions that you can take on the federal level to combat environmental racism and climate change. There are also important steps that you can take in New York State.
Urgent action is needed to pass the Climate and Community Investment Act by the end of the legislative session of the New York State government on June 10th. The CCIA will raise $15 billion a year from corporate polluters. And this will be used to fund 150,000 well-paying jobs in communities of color, construct energy-efficient and solar-powered homes, and large-scale renewable infrastructure. It will provide energy rebates for low and moderate income New Yorkers and fund training and relief for workers in the fossil fuel industry and disadvantaged communities. And here's a video from New York News on the CCIA.
My name is Anna, and I am a supporter of the CCIA.
I support the CCIA.
I support the CCIA.
I support the CCIA.
And I support the CCIA.
The Climate and Community Investment Act is a climate justice bill that is for the people of New York, and the latest work by New York Renews. After the 2019 victory of passing the landmark legislation, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, we are moving swiftly to begin funding the just transition for all of New York State. The CCIA would make polluters pay $55 per ton of greenhouse gas emissions and other harmful co-pollutants that are blasted into our communities. The CCIA supports a renewable economy, one that would create 150,000 good green jobs that prioritize women, the formerly incarcerated, BIPOC New Yorkers, and those coming out of the unemployment crisis caused by this pandemic. This bill also supports the care economy. It is time to invest in our families and our youth and give them a seat at the climate table. It is time to build a world that we want to see. 30% of funds will be used for large-scale renewable energy projects such as offshore wind, grid stability, solar array projects, public transit, and much more. The clock is ticking and the time is now. With only 1 month left before the New York State legislative session ends, we must act now to help invest in our communities that have been hit first and hit worse by the climate crisis.
Francis, you're muted.
Can you go back, please, one slide? Okay, it's fine. In the next few minutes, I'll share 2 brief narrative films about our broken prison and immigration system as they play out in mass incarceration and immigrant detention, and tell you how we got into this mess. Then we'll look at some pending legislation, and you'll have a chance to contact legislators locally and nationally to support humanitarian changes. First, mass incarceration and initiatives in New York State.
When we think of prisons, if we bother to think of them at all, that is, there is a tendency to see them as institutions completely divorced from human society.
We have 25% of the world's prison population and only 5% of the world's population. In other words, we are way over incarcerating compared to any other country in the world.
I find it a bit disturbing that we have more prisoners than China, and they have 1 billion more people than we do.
Billions of dollars have been poured into the prison expansion.
Cabinet-level efforts and Congress creating very powerful new laws.
We are finally beginning to win the war against crime.
Virtually everybody thought the drug war was the #1 issue.
Drugs are menacing our society. They're threatening our values and undercutting our institutions. They're killing our children.
It's almost like overnight we had this great idea. Hey, what if we go after the users?
New laws to punish them, new agents to arrest them, new prosecutors to convict them, and new prisons to hold them.
It's very similar to the days of alcohol prohibition, where the government has just declared millions and millions of people to be criminals.
It's a lot watching your children grow up and miss you and wave and say bye, Daddy, as they're walking out of a visit. It's just, it doesn't get easy.
It's just an experience that it either is going to make you or break you. Being in the hole is an experience that I wouldn't wish on anybody.
A very, very large number of people serving decades in prison in America, and basically nobody really cares.
Slides. So 2.3 million New Yorkers are living with a conviction history. They face closed doors for employment, housing, and higher education, essentially a civic life sentence and a state of perpetual punishment. Black and brown New Yorkers disproportionately experience this life sentence after decades of discriminatory over-policing, an over-prosecution across our state. 27% of those formerly incarcerated are unemployed. Next slide. Giving people a clean slate is life-changing. More than 400,000 New Yorkers are arrested on criminal charges each year. If you have a prison term, essentially your earnings are cut in half over a lifetime, something like $484,000. In Michigan, when expungement of prison records was instituted, individual wages within 2 years rose 25%. And after 5 years, the same group of individuals were less likely than the general public to commit a crime. So there is a solution in New York, and this is the New York State Clean Slate, which would automatically expunge conviction histories in a graduated manner. The current application system is way too complicated. It exacerbates the ongoing racist and economic inequity that we have in our country. In the 3 years that New York's sealing law has been in effect, fewer than 0.5% of eligible individuals have had their records cleared. Next slide. So automatic expungement is a graduated process. With all other conditions met, individuals will have their records sealed after 1 year for a misdemeanor and after 3 years for a felon. In other words, they will not be available when someone applies for a job, housing, or education application. And after 5 years for a misdemeanor and 7 for a felon, the court record is automatically expunged and an individual begins again with a clean slate. Next one. So in the breakout room, you'll be able to take action and to encourage New York State legislators in this final week of the Assembly session to support clean slate, as well as the second piece of pending legislation, Less is More, which Mika Mistrangi will also talk about in our breakout room. And that addresses an unjust parole system. So now let's look at immigration detention. For a more thorough discussion, next slide, please. For a more thorough discussion, I encourage you to look at the listing there for a YouTube program, and also to look into the Sojourners Ministry at Riverside Church. In the 20 years that in 2020, the United States spent $25 billion to catch, detain, and deport immigrants. We detained more than 52,000 a day in that year, and that number now is closer to 30,000, but still, humanitarian system needs to be instituted. Immigrants have committed no crimes, only a civil violation, yet they're locked up in prison-type centers, 70% of which are for-profit facilities, and they are kept for weeks to years. They lack a right to legal representation. They have no accountability. These facilities have no accountability, so there's widespread violation and frequent verbal, physical, and sexual abuse. What does this look like? Video.
Part and parcel of the same thing. It's like, we don't want you here. We don't want you here, so we're going to make it really bad. We are locking people up. We're sending them back to countries where they're in danger. This is a life and death situation for people.
In the Trump administration, people started saying, this is a deterrent policy. This is a punitive policy. We're going to use detention as a way to punish people.
Decades of detention in America have not deterred the flow of migrants. And unrest and instability in Central America has caused yet another surge of immigrants arriving at the U.S. border in 2019. At the same time, it's fueled a thriving industry run mostly by private prison companies, who now hold more than 70% of detainees.
The reality of immigration detention is that people are locked up in county jails. They're locked up in federal prisons. They're locked up in privately owned and profit-maximizing institutions that are surrounded by barbed wire.
By September of 2019, more than 52,000 people were held in detention. On average, they were held for over a month, some spending years behind bars and costing American taxpayers billions of dollars.
It is a history of failed efforts to deal with the real issues involved in immigration. And so you focus on what's easy politically. And what is easy politically? Detainment, enforcement, border security, the whole idea of building walls.
It's not really just about the border, it's about the entire system. I would start
by looking at what are the conditions that are driving people to leave their homes and come up to the U.S.
A civil incarceration system born 40 years ago has now become the foundation of America's approach to immigration. And it hasn't solved the issues that led to its creation in the first place: a large undocumented population and migrants at the southern border fleeing violence. And it continues to grow, becoming what is now the largest immigrant detention system in the world.
I think history is going to look back on this moment in time and paint not a very attractive picture of how America handled this moment. You're looking for somebody to blame. Fact is, we're all to blame for what happened.
Next slide. So most immigrants who are apprehended in New Jersey and New York by ICE are taken principally to county jails or for-profit detention facilities in New Jersey and a few in upstate New York. So we want to ask governors and legislators to end this practice. ICE is continuing to look for new facilities within 60 miles of New York City, even as local counties are terminating their contracts with ICE. Next slide. What this means is that ICE funding, the proposed state actions include two. One is the New Jersey detention bill, and the New York one is dignity, not detention. They will basically end, in both New Jersey and New York, they will end the current contracts with ICE and allow no new ones and no renewal of existing ones. So in the breakout rooms, we will look at these bills specifically, and you'll have an opportunity to contact New York and New Jersey legislators and governors to support them. And likewise, you will have an opportunity to write to the Secretary of Homeland Security, Alexis Mayorkas, in support of the end of these inhumane policies. Thank you.
At the beginning of this program, we were eloquently reminded of our calling to see justice prevail. We pray now that we will be further moved to action by this rendering of Lift Every Voice and Sing, to pray for the persistence to write letters and make phone calls, and indeed march on until victory is won. Thank you.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the roaring sea.
Thank you
Amen.
all.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
joining us.
Great job. Wonderful.
Well
So
done.
good to see everyone.